Hello, and welcome to Wrestling with Poetry, Kalamazoo, Michigan's premier wrestling and poetry podcast. The wrestling topic today is authenticity in wrestling. Why did wrestling become predetermined? We will get into that in a minute, but first, let's hear from poet Rae Armantrout. Rae Armantrout has 15 previous books including Conjure, Wobble, finalist for a National Book Award, Partly, New and Selected Poems, Itself, Just Saying, Money Shot, and Versed, which received a Pulitzer Prize and a National Book Critics Circle Award. Her latest and 11th book published by Wesleyan was Finalists. Armantrout is Professor Emerita of Writing at the University of California at San Diego. She has been published in many anthologies, including the Oxford Book of American Poetry and Scribner's Best American Poetry, and in such magazines as Harper's, The New Yorker, American Poetry Review, Boston Review, Chicago Review, and the Los Angeles Times Book Review. She lives in Everett, Washington.
This is Rae Armantrout reading Gorgeous. Some poets will tell you that stanza means room, like they were on to an important secret, like you could live there if worse came to worst. Oddly, the ring where wrestling matches are staged is actually square, so there are corners to retreat to, I suppose. Some good wrestling moves are the outsider edge, the camel clutch, and the curb stomp. I don't know much about wrestling. I found these moves on the internet. I was already familiar with the in-jammed line and the volta. My grandmother, who lived with us when I was a child, was a big wrestling fan. Her favorite was Gorgeous George. She also loved Liberace, but that is and isn't another story. I got glimpses of wrestlers on her TV. Looking back, it's hard to reconcile the memory of the taciturn, circumspect woman I knew in her house coat and pin curls, that old woman who was widowed young and never remarried, with the images of garish men that filled her screen. I've been looking up pictures of Gorgeous George, trying to figure out what was gorgeous about him. It wasn't his body or his face. His hair was in a wavy blonde bouffant. In some photos he is dressed as a 19th century dandy. The clothes remind me of the outfits worn by British rock bands in the 1960s. Was George performing a parody of beauty? Did he figure that people have a secret desire to see it thrown and stomped? Was he a good target because he played at looking feminine? Is that what my grandmother liked about him? Some people think poetry is for sissies. I wish now I had watched with her. Maybe then I'd have some idea of what these guys meant to her. A lot could go on in the head of a quiet woman in a tiny room in a small tract house in the 1950s. Okay, here comes the curb stomp in a stanza.
What a fantastic reading. Thank you so much, Rae. This week we have a question, which I will now read. I really enjoyed Gabe Cruz's poetry and meditations on boxing versus poetry, particularly the bit about boxing being an art best appreciated by other boxers, and how that inward-looking relationship resembles poetry. I guess that takes us to first principles, though. What is kayfabe to an art which is about moment-to-moment realness and reaction? In other words, how might poetry develop a public face which isn't a false one? Or the right kind of false face? Must it always react by flinching, jabbing, and dodging? Your friend, Mavis in Memphis. I understand this question as asking how can poetry talk to people in general, rather than being simply poets talking to poets. Mavis, if I'm wrong about that, just email next week. One thing a person can do is make their poetry part of the landscape if you want to talk to people in general. Raul Zurita and the collective which he was part of, CADA, Colectivo de Acciones de Arte, has passages of his poems, The New Life, written in the sky over Manhattan. This happened in the 1980s. He also had bulldozed the phrase, ni peña ni miedo, without pain or fear, into the Atacama Desert, later in the 1980s. These acts of big writing require coordination. You need to know or be a pilot if you want to do skywriting. You need to know someone who has a bulldozer, or to have the money to rent a bulldozer, or you have to know how to hotwire a bulldozer. What I'm saying is you need skills. But these things have been done, so they can be done again. One easy thing a person can do is to put their poem on outdoor walls. In Venice Beach, California, there are walls of poetry on the beach, like on the side of an outdoor bathroom and various other places. But Venice, California is famous for its poetry monument. The poets are interesting. Wanda Coleman is among the poets up there. Also, in the Netherlands, in Leiden, there are over 100 wall poems, which are poems written on the outside of buildings. Here's a suggestion. You can implant your poem in another work of art. For instance, you can post a large version of your poem on a wall or visible in the landscape and then take a picture of it. These are just some ideas off the top of my head. You can use a projector and project your poems against buildings like Hassan Sacker did in Philadelphia in the aughts. Projectors are cheaper than ever. I think that's a great idea. There are ways of getting poems into the landscape, and inevitably they will be read. Think about the billboards. I suppose you could also record and then broadcast poems from the speakers of a car, and you can play that early, drive around all day with your windows open, poems blaring out of your car. That is if you want it to be ambient and intangible, just in the air. Mavis, have you ever tried putting poems casually in the environment, such as in Craigslist or in the Penny Saver? You could Google it. Penny Saver is back. You could also put a poem in the comment of a post. Well, once you write it and you share it, it'll take its own direction. Of course, not everybody will think that your projects are poetry, but it will be the people who recognize it as poetry. Those will be the ones you want to pay attention to. I don't know. I hope I answered that right. It was a great question, and I thank you very much, Mavis, for paying attention to the show and participating. Authenticity. As I mentioned in episode 4, pro wrestling began on the carnival circuit. What began as a strongman contest of strength would become wrestling because the carnies could make more money off of it through betting, person against person. Carnies worked on wrestling matches behind the scenes, creating moves that would seem gruesome, violent, or acrobatic for mass appeal. The moves were known as hooks. Many hooks that are outrageous and technically illegal are irresistible to the wrestling fan. The eye gouge, certain kinds of suplexes, the fish hook where the wrestler pulls back the other guy's lips and nose. These are attractive, the way a car accident is. While carnies developed a wrestler's routine, the impresarios advertised the matches and drummed up crowd interest. Barnstormers were traveling wrestlers who worked with the carnies and added to the drama of the fights. They brought their own hooks and backstories. In this setting, carnies would always keep an eye on the crowd to see who had money and who was spending it copiously. They would mark the spendy people with chalk and then target them and convince them to bet on the wrestling match. To this day, the word mark refers to a fan who doesn't understand that wrestling is a performance and who is irresponsible with his money. Carnival wrestling matches were rigged so that the promoters and wrestlers could make as much money as possible. The media was on to wrestling. They tried to warn people. The Seattle Times said in 1911, "It is safe to say in 99% of all wrestling matches where an admission fee is charged and where professionals take part have been prearranged before the men shake hands." Even the Heckenschmidt-Gotch match of the year 1908 was rigged. Sure, Gotch was good at wrestling, but he was a dirty wrestler, famous for eye gouging and pulling at ears. Leo Thies also said that Gotch enjoyed causing pain. He was a sadist. There's that. In 1911, there would be a rematch where Heckenschmidt agreed as long as Gotch left his leg alone. His leg had been bothering him. Now, this was unlikely to happen because Frank Gotch has a signature move, which is the toe hold. He's credited with inventing it. So although he agreed to leave George Hackenschmidt's leg alone, he did not. As a matter of fact, that's the first thing he went for. That is how he forced Hackenschmidt's submission and humiliated him. Gotch remained famous in the U.S., but he retired in 1914 and died a few years later at the age of 40. Hackenschmidt, on the other hand, lasted until 1968. Meanwhile, in America, wrestling lost its audience because the most famous match of 1911, the George Hackenschmidt versus Frank Gotch match, was so clearly rigged. What saved the sport from extinction was the innovations that were devised in Canada in the 1920s. These included more carnival-type tactics like aerial moves and weirder holds. The matches would become succinct instead of matches that could last for hours and hours. There was a round and a bout. I'll get to that later. The people responsible for these changes are called the Gold Dust Trio: Ed Strangler Lewis and his manager, Billy Sandow, and the wrestler Joseph Toots Mondt, M-O-N-D-T. Did they convince anyone of the reality of the win? No, not so much. The reality that they were selling was the spectacle. The real reality is that it's being done for money, and that's why it was saved. Otherwise, it's just community theater of a more outrageous type. The fact that it's being done by people who contribute their personas and skilled moves, that's significant. And the fact that the wrestlers at all pay scales are keeping the fantasy going, that's authentic. A lot of the information that I got for this podcast, this particular one, is from Funknown, which is a video, and it is Why Wrestling is Fake. That is on YouTube. Also, ProWrestlingStories.com, the original wrestling screwjob, FanaticWrestling.com, and Frank Gotch's Wikipedia. I recommend those sources. They're pretty interesting. Events. Satellite Records will have a featured reader at its open mic, which is held on Thursdays, 5:30 p.m. Satellite Records is at 808 South West Nedge Avenue in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Wrestling event. Independent Pro Wrestling Redemption. Saturday, September 2nd at the Patterson Ice Center, 2550 Patterson Avenue Southeast. That is in Grand Rapids. The doors open at 6 p.m. The match begins at 7 p.m. Questions? Comments? Concerns? Why not email me at wrestlingwithpoetry@gmail.com and I will address your concerns and or questions on air. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Rae. Thank you, etc. Have a great day. Please be well.